Good afternoon. I'm Carol Looper. I'm a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and I'm a retired television news reporter. But as I've learned after 3 years of retirement, you never retire. I'm a news junkie. It's great to see all of you here today. Today's forum is called Charter Schools, Good and Bad, featuring Ohio Auditor Dave Yost. It's presented in partnership with kidsohio.org, with support from the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation and Hannah News Service. Please help me thank Mark Reel and our guests with Kids Ohio. Today's forum, as you may have gathered, is very timely as we continue to see news stories, commercials, lawsuits, and editorials around charter schools. Our speakers today hopefully will shed some light and some clarity around matters of funding, educational standards, and most importantly, student outcomes. Please welcome State Senator from Ohio's 6th District, Peggy Lehner. From the Fordham Institute, Vice President for Ohio Policy and Advocacy, Chad Aldis. Our host today, reporter at the Ohio Statehouse News Bureau, Andy Chow, and Auditor of the State of Ohio, Dave Yost. Auditor Yost will provide us a brief overview of the issues, and then Andy will take over to host the panel for conversation. Auditor Yost, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you all for being here today. It's my great privilege to serve you as your Auditor of State. And my role is, as an independently elected constitutional office holder, is to be the independent voice of review and accountability for state and local governments. I'm proud to have here today with me a few of our members of our senior staff. We have a great team at the Auditor's Office. I grew up in politics under former Mayor Buck Reinhardt, who always told me, David, hire people that are smarter than you are, you'll look better. And I'd like to thank them for coming today. If you'd stand for just a moment. This is Sean Buskin, Brenda Reinhardt, and Carrie Bartunik. So, what to say in 9 minutes or less, as Andy said, and I try to emphasize the or less when I'm invited to speak somewhere, and want to get to your questions so we can talk about what you'd like to do. So I'm going to limit my comments to a particular area that is important, I think, in the current context, the current environment, and that is virtual schooling. Now, I think most of us probably had the experience during our schooling of being frustrated by the slow pace of a class. Obviously, a teacher has to worry about all of the students in the class and is going to take it at a tempo that's going to give a chance for almost everybody or everybody to come along and learn. Well, if you're unfortunate enough to be able to easily grasp the subject matter, you're going to become easily bored, which I was on occasion. On other occasions, and probably none of you had this experience, we were studying things that weren't particularly easy for me to grasp. And so I struggled to keep up with the pace of the class. Virtual learning is a great boon to our children because it takes into differences those differences in the way we learn, the different speeds with which we learn. When it's done well, and I've seen it done well, the progress of each student can be monitored, and the teaching style and the resources available can be adapted to that individual kid. So a child who really doesn't need it explained, they read it, they get it, they want to move on, can do just a computer-based lesson and they're rocking it. And a kid that's maybe struggling a little bit to come up with, to really break through and master the program, the material, A teacher can notice that they're lagging behind and come along and give them, instead of front of the classroom 1 on 25 input and coaching and teaching, they can become very personalized in a one-on-one, almost tutoring kind of feel. So it's a much better application of our scarcest resource in education, great teachers. We're dividing up, that's the great innovation of virtual education, is that the teachers that support the virtual learning environment can use their highly valuable, highly skilled time to be very targeted instead of generalized, a rifle shot, if you will, instead of a shotgun. Well, the way we do the funding and the regulation for this in Ohio is antiquated. It was imported from the way we've always done brick and mortar schools, which is we want you to have a certain number of days of instruction. You got to go to school. If you don't go to school, you're not learning, you're not going to graduate. So we fund, without getting into all of the arcane details, and believe me, if you've ever read Title 33, it's arcane. The bottom line is we pay for kids based on the number, or pay for schools based on the number of kids in the school, and we track whether they're actually going to school. And there's time limits set that you have to meet in order to qualify for funding. The problem is the very premise of virtual schools is antithetical to the idea of paying by time. Why are we going to worry about how many hours Jimmy was in class or in the virtual classroom, the online classroom, if he mastered the material? Now, another quirk in Ohio law, and this was fixed in the major reform, charter school reform that was passed last year with the leadership of Senator Lehner and the support of many other good actors in the field, including Mr. Aldis and Fordham Institute, changes this quirk in the law, which only requires offerings. The idea originally was, back in the beginning of virtual schools, is, look, kids show up right now in traditional brick and mortars. They sit in the back of the room. They fall asleep. Been there, done that. They don't learn anything. They don't participate, but they're in school, and we pay for that. So why should we really treat it differently online? Well, it turns out that experience is a great teacher, and the reason we should treat it differently online is twofold. Number one, as I said, paying by hours undercuts the very premise and the great promise of virtual schooling, allowing children to learn at their own pace for the subject matter before them. But the second reason is, at least in a traditional public school, the traditional brick and mortar school, the students are in the presence of the teacher. They're in the presence of the other students, and there's interaction going on. There's regular prodding going on. The teacher can, a very good teacher, can bring even a reluctant student along with. That does not exist in the online environment. If you want to just log on, and get your credential for having been on that day, and you don't want to study, there's nobody looking over your shoulder. Nobody's going to knock on your bedroom door and say, stop sleeping, you're supposed to be at the computer going to school. Nobody's going to say, turn off the video game. And so it's fundamentally different. I'm arguing that we should move to learning-based funding for virtual schools, so that the virtual school gets paid when you master some unit of the information that you're supposed to be mastering, that you're supposed to be learning. Let's think about this for just a moment. At the end of the day, what are we trying to do with our tax dollars? We're trying to buy a process that produces a numerate, literate citizen at the end of the day. Why not pay for learning instead of hours in a seat or hours in front of a screen? So with that, I will turn this over to Andy, and we'll have our panel discussion. But thank you again so much for your interest in this critically important topic.
play musical chairs here now. So as Auditor Yost just illustrated, charter schools are going through somewhat of a transitional period right now. We've had some newer regulations implemented. We've had lawmakers who have more of the political will and leadership to actually tackle these issues that have been kind of floating around for a while. There have been national groups who have said that Ohio is the wild, wild west of charter schools because of the lack of regulations over the years. And even more recently, even after the passing of HB2, the HBO show John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, his video went viral talking about just how badly the charter school system might be in Ohio. So it seems like, as far as public opinion goes, there's still a long way to go. Senator Lehner, I'll toss the first question to you, and then Chad, you can respond too. Sort of going off of what Auditor Yost explained about some of the more current issues that are facing charter schools right now. Senator, what do you think is one of the most glaring issues standing in front of charter schools right now?
Well, I think there continue to be many. And I think one of the problems is, one of the challenges for Ohio is that we were one of the first states to really enter into the charter world. There weren't a whole lot of models for us to look at. So we had very few laws and regulations, and those that we did have weren't necessarily proven to be helpful. So we've sort of been flying by the seat of our pants ever since 2000, when we first started really getting into this. And so we were long overdue for a careful, thoughtful look at where the charter school sector is. Now, one real word of caution is I think we shouldn't move too fast to make too many changes too quickly, because education is not something that changes things overnight. We need to have some time, I'd say 3 years probably, to really evaluate whether the provisions we put into House Bill 2 are the correct ones, if they're working well. There are some obvious gaps in what we did with House Bill 2, things that were left undone that I don't think have to wait for 3 years. One of those is looking at dropout recovery schools. We really didn't touch them much in House Bill 2, but we have a lot of them out there, and many of them are showing very, very poor graduation rates. We need to address that. We need to evaluate that, and it's one of the things that we'll do soon. The other thing is online learning. I mean, we have some real questions, and I think the bill didn't necessarily address that. I'm very intrigued by the auditor's suggestion of performance-based funding for online schools. I think there's a lot of potential in that, and we definitely should look at that. The third piece that was left undone deals with special needs schools, those schools that are largely educating children with severe learning needs. That's another piece that left to be undone. But overall, I think we need to give the reforms time to work and evaluate them carefully.
Yeah, I think Senator Lehner hit a lot of key points. What I would say, though, the biggest glaring issue, and Andy, you alluded to this in your question, and that is the sector's past. There have been many documented examples of ineffective oversight, potential conflicts of interest. The auditor at times has had a hard time auditing some schools, just as other entities of government once in a while have a hard time getting audited. And those things are real, and they're in the public's mind. So what we're seeing with the House Bill 2 reforms that Senator Lehner led the charge on passing, you're already seeing the incentive structure being changed in the charter school sector. Sponsors are taking a very close eye when they're choosing to renew a charter school or not, when they're deciding what schools are good enough to open that will serve students well. And so when Senator Lehner says it'll take 3 years, that's exactly right. It'll take a time for those contracts to expire and new ones to be entered into or not, and for the incentive structure to get right. But the early indications from even this first year, from just the prospect of having a more rigorous evaluation system for sponsors who are the overseers of charter schools, just the very prospect of that analysis getting ready to come out in October means that sponsors are taking a very close eye. And I think that's a fantastic improvement, but it's going to take a while to rebuild the public's confidence. It didn't sour overnight among some, and it's going to take a while to rebuild. But it can it misses the notion that if any of you, well, you're in Columbus, there are some fantastic charter schools in Columbus. The United Schools Network, the Graham family of schools, KIPP, these are schools that by any measure are making a huge difference for their kids. Some of the flexibilities of charter schools have allowed them to do that of our law, and we need to make sure that we're highlighting that and fixing what isn't working. So I'll stop.
And Chad, can you briefly just give us a quick refresher? What are some of these terms? What is a sponsor? What is an operator? Can you catch us up?
You see, if you use technical terms, you get more time at the microphone. So when you start off with the first thing I think when you're looking at a charter school structure, there's similarities to traditional public schools and there's some differences. A charter school has an independent governing board, sort of like a school board, but it's usually over one school. Then that board has a contract with a sponsor. Called an authorizer in some states. Sponsors are the entity that have sort of a quasi-governmental role determining whether this public school gets to stay open or close, can expand, and a lot of other things, but it doesn't actually get involved in the day-to-day operations of a school, which makes the accountability aspect a little fuzzy sometimes. And then finally, sometimes charter school governing boards will contract with either nonprofit or for-profit companies to help them with various aspects of operation. So these are often called operators or management companies. So when you hear us throwing around the terminology, now House Bill 2 covered lots of different components of that and has improvements, I think, in each of those areas. And we may get into some of that today or not, but that's sort of the landscape and sort of the key players when you're looking at charter schools.
All right, so let's get into the big issue that is in the headlines, that's in the newspapers, that's happening in the Franklin County Courthouse right now, which is the electronic classroom of tomorrow, also known as ECOT, is fighting the Ohio Department of Education right now over how it records learning opportunities. And Auditor Yost talked about this already a lot, because when you're in e-school, taking attendance is just different. You just have to measure it in a different way. And I think the state and other officials are just trying to figure out how do we go about doing that. And so, Auditor, you said let's switch it over to a learning-based initiative instead. Let's base funding off of if kids are completing courses. But for right now, as the law stands, should ECOT have to prove that their kids are learning? And as of right now, do you think that they're doing a good job doing that?
Well, that's several questions. And I'll point out as a precatory comment that traditional brick and mortar schools are not required to prove that their kids are learning. They're graded, just like schools in the charter sector are on achievement, academic achievement. But we don't require that anybody actually learns is actually learning. And maybe that's a large global question we ought to be talking about. As far as ECOT goes, ECOT's kind of a Dickensian in the sense of A Tale of Two Cities. It's the best in this, and it's the worst in some ways. When I say the worst, I mean there's clearly a graduation rate of 38%, something that bothers me. Clearly there are some kids that have little or no interaction with the school, and that's something that I think policymakers ought to be concerned about. At the same token, I met a kid that came down with brain cancer in the middle of his sophomore year and was in a horrible, life-jolting treatment pattern. And he hadn't been a great student before he was diagnosed. And he transferred to ECOT because he couldn't possibly live under the truancy rules of the traditional brick and mortar schools with the treatment on and off. We all know how cancer treatment works. He graduated last summer from ECOT. This is a kid who otherwise would have been thrown away. He would have slipped through the cracks. And I've met many others, young women who became pregnant in high school and otherwise would have dropped out. The model works exceedingly well for some populations. It's probably not for everybody. And one of the things that I think policymakers need to really consider is in our portfolio of school opportunities, should there be a greater assessment on learning styles and who should be in what kind of environment?
I was going to say that's exactly the problem I think that we face with our online schools is like every other public school. We have to remember charter schools are public schools. They cannot turn anyone away. That if you apply and there's a slot in the school, they have to accept you. Well, online learning is very different, and not everyone can do it. Right now, if a child applies to ECOT who totally lacks the discipline necessary to do online learning, they have to take them in. And that child may turn that computer on and walk away and watch TV all day long, for all we know. I think there needs to be some way to assess the likelihood of a child being successful in online learning. And that includes parental support, some sort of supervision. And I do think we need to be able to measure, maybe not the number of hours that a student stays on, but at a certain point in time, we ought to know if they're 50% through the class work, or 75%, or 100%. Right now, we don't know that. They may be 1% through 4 months into it, and they haven't learned a thing. So I think we need to make some changes there.
And those are,
We saw that when you and I went to Carpe Diem down in Cincinnati as a school that actually measures the progress of the kids through each unit of each subject.
Right, and it's very possible.
and those are the proposals, and that's maybe how you can fix the system. But for right now, there's $106 million on the line. We're trying to figure out, did kids take an opportunity to learn? What is a learning opportunity? There have been critics who have said, well, providing a learning opportunity just means giving kids a laptop and hoping that they log on and do the work themselves. So as for right now, should ECOT be keeping that funding? What's going to happen to that money, and how do we measure that? Chad, do you want to jump in here?
Oh, you give me the easy one. Great. That's pretty direct, Andy. No, actually, I think this is an important issue, but I think what we're seeing play out in the courthouse right now is exactly what should be playing out given our current circumstances. We have a situation where there's a contractual dispute between the Department of Education and a large online school. There's questions about administrative law. There's questions about statutory law. When did the changes in House Bill 2 apply? When did they not? We run a big risk here by focusing on this and the $100 million and missing the fact that a new school year has started. And in this new school year, House Bill 2 is applicable, and it says that you need to be tracking learning opportunities. I am less concerned, let the courts do what the courts do. I'm less concerned with about sunk costs, quite honestly, about what's happened. Now, if they're made to repay it and the law says so, then they will. And if not, then they won't. But going forward, are we doing what's right for students? Are we tracking learning opportunities being provided the way the law now requires it? And so that's, it's a great discussion. It's great over cocktails, but my concern is it doesn't get us to the answer we need to make sure the structure's in place going forward.
Senator, you've helped craft some of these laws, and you're a member of the legislature. As you know, as you see the law, what does ECOT need to do to prove that it has earned this $100 million?
Well, I would absolutely agree with Chad that, the question of whether or not this is being applied retroactively, whether or not the department created a manual that required this prior to House Bill 2, those are all legal questions. But what they should be doing right now today is figuring out how every single child in that school is going to be tracked to know that they are taking advantage of the learning opportunities that have been given to them. Handing someone a book and say, here's a book, is not teaching anything. Right. But asking them at the end of a chapter, what did the main character do? Where were they? What did this all mean? That's learning, and that's what we need to make sure that all children are doing, and not just children sitting in a brick and mortar school.
Auditor, do you have any thoughts on what does ECOT need to do to prove that it has earned this $100 million to actually provide education to kids?
I don't have a lot to add except one thing to educate everybody about an arcane idea in auditing. We audit to external standards, objective standards. We don't get to decide the equities of a situation. So when you say, what do they need to prove that they earned it? That's asking two questions. The first question is, what do you legally have to do to be entitled to payment? And that's fairly well set, and it's reviewed, and that's what our office does. The larger question, which we're beginning to have a discussion about, is what is it we as taxpayers expect to receive for the money that we are paying? That's a separate question, and it really falls not to the Auditor of State, but to the General Assembly and to the Department of Education to determine.
That's where questions more like a graduation rate need to be examined. ECOT's graduation rate is 38%. However, we do need to take into account they have children with suffering from brain cancer. They have children who are delivering babies. So you can't expect them to have a graduation rate of 90%, which a suburban school may have, but is 38% reasonable? And I think that's the sort of thing, we need the tools to know how much they're participating in order to really come up with a conclusion as to whether or not a 38% graduation rate is acceptable. We have some dropout recovery schools in this state with 5, 6, 7, 8% graduation rates. Is that acceptable? One of the things that we know often happens is that because in order to apply for TANF, you have to show you're in school. So some people sign up for a dropout recovery school. They don't go at all until the very last day that they need to go to prove that they're truant or not. Then they go in, sign in that day, and the clock starts all over again. It's a major scam. How many kids are doing that? How many students are doing that? We need the answers to these kind of questions, and I think we're starting for the very first time in a long time to focus on getting those answers.
You know, we found a dropout recovery school, back to the TANF issue. It's also frequently a condition of probation for an 18 or 19-year-old that you go back and earn your diploma. And we found a school that was conveniently located one floor, I don't remember if it was below or above the probation department in that town.
Yeah.
Chad, you and the Fordham Institute have been a big proponent of school choice, but also a big proponent of adding accountability, adding transparency when needed. And you've been on the record of saying that the biggest threat to charter schools is a bad charter school. How do we as the public, or how do we as officials, how do you identify what is a bad charter school? And is there ever a time where it's okay to say, to call out specific schools and say, I'm sorry, but you're just not doing what you should be doing. It's time for you to close.
Yeah. That's the problem with writing too much or putting too many press releases out, because people use your words against you. No. I think the first measure that I think, and the traditional public schools face this, and as do public charter schools, and that is the first measure people will look at are your state report cards. You know, are your students proficient? But beyond that, there's also proficient meaning passing the state test. Are they reading and writing at the level and doing math at the level you'd expect? But beyond that, there's also a provision in Ohio that looks at growth. And you'll see the top urban schools in our state, whether they're charter school or traditional public schools, they do very well on value-added measures. They exceed what the state would expect students in their school to learn. And so I think that's a measure of quality as well. But we also shouldn't get into that test scores are the only thing, because we know they're not. You know, you want to use it as a foundational element in terms of, you know, in general, your students' lives are going to be better if they can read and do math when they get out of high school. But that alone will not lead to success either. So there's all those other factors that will be determined individually, school level, just as in the traditional public school sector. So it's complex. I think I'm cut off. Oh, it's complex, and it should be. Ohio has a mandatory closure law for charter schools, so if they fall below a certain threshold, charter schools, unlike traditional public schools, are required by law to close. Now, most schools don't fall under that threshold, but that is there, it's on the book, so it provides a stopgap.
What I'd like to know, and anybody jump in here, what happens to the students when a school shuts down?
You probably know that.
Well, we actually did a study on that we released a year or two ago that found that, this was using Ohio data, student level data, that showed that students in a school that closed generally had, when they transferred, generally had an improved performance. It was modest, and that is accounting for what we know is a loss of learning when a student changes schools in general. No matter what the cycle is, in general you expect to see a loss, but when a school that's low performing closes academically, typically the student will do better.
You know, one of the challenges that we face when it comes to closing schools is we very frequently will hear people, proponents of charters, say, well, it doesn't make sense to close down that charter school because the child's only going to go down the street to their public school that has equally poor outcomes. And my response to that is that there's a certain responsibility that we put on charter schools when we grant them the ability to be exempt from a lot of state laws and regulations. They're also exempt from the same level of funding, but it's a privilege to be able to open a charter school. And when you fail, what you do when you open a charter school is say, I'm going to do something different. I've got a model that's going to work. It's going to make a difference in kids' lives. When that experiment fails, you should lose your right to have that privilege. And I'm not, you know, I don't like them going back to the public school where it's also rated F and they don't have opportunities. But we can't continue to allow experiments to fail and just add to this situation of choosing one bad school over another. We have to fix them all.
All right, in a few minutes, we're going to be moving towards audience questions, so feel free to start lining up. But I want to add some breaking news that the Federal Education Department has released the $71 million that was awarded to Ohio, I guess, a year ago, to help the charter school system, to help improve charter schools. What happens next? What happens with that money going forward? What happens next?
Well, this money is specifically designated to go to high-performing schools to help them replicate and expand, perhaps to bring new models in from out of the state that haven't been willing to come to Ohio up to now. So I expect to see quality schools opening or expanding, which is a good thing. It's also a pretty good signal that the federal government recognizes that we have made significant strides. A year ago, they were very concerned about letting us have this grant, which we had won, and they've been holding the money back for a year. Now they're saying, we think you're on the right track. And that's good news. That's good news in lots of different ways.
Chad, it's good news for you, right?
Well, not personally.
No.
No. This is, we certainly applaud this decision. We think it's the right thing to do. The good thing is there's a quality control measure built in, as Senator Lehner said. It's going to go to schools with the high likelihood of improving student achievement, which is what the charter school sector can and should be about. But it brings up the other issue, Andy, and one of the reasons this is so critical in the charter sector, and it might not be as important to others, is because of the funding disparity that charter schools still have. Charter schools are typically funded, a statewide study found at about 72 cents on the dollar compared to traditional public schools. In our urban areas, that is between 60 and 65 cents on the dollar in Ohio. That's with all sources sort of all in. That's really, really a difficult situation to put charters in. There are great charter schools that struggle, that can't open new campuses because of those lack of equitable funds. It also raises sort of a question that we should consider, because if we don't consider it, others will. And that is, if we're funding students that disproportionately serve low income and students of color at 72 cents on the dollar, what does that say? How long before someone pays attention to that fact?
Auditor, do you have any thoughts on the new money coming in?
Yeah, we will be, the new money is going to have requires a independent monitor by the federal requirements to watch the spending and approve it in advance. We will also be taking a deeper dive when we do our audit of ODE during those 3 years and looking at that. But just to piggyback on something you said, Chad, one of the questions in my mind is, are we going to get better performance. It's kind of if we look around at some of the poorest performing schools, they're doing some of the highest per pupil spending. So one of the other benefits of this grant is going to be if we do attract some of these higher performing models to open in Ohio, we will have a real life laboratory to be able to tell whether funding at 72 cents on the dollar is actually having an impact on the quality of charters and whether we need to revisit that issue here in Ohio.
Okay. All right. It is the CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments.
Is that us or them?
I guess anybody. And so let's go with the first question.
Yes, my name is John McKnight, and I was not a very good student in the K through 12 range. I was not very engaged, not very academic, and I would have loved to have the opportunity to participate in the online schools that wasn't around back then. Academically, I might have done better, but where I've really found my place in life is all now related to my social and maybe my artistic abilities, which are things that I learned by being at the school that I didn't want to be at. Whether the experiences I had were rewarding, if I happened to make a good presentation in front of a classroom where I felt like a star, or more often, when they were the bad experiences I had, all of that affected me and helped me become what I am now. Is there any attention being paid to the social aspects of the online schools and how that might affect kids' abilities down the road?
I don't think there's anything in law that applies to that. What I will say is, it's interesting you bring up the social aspects, because one of the biggest things I often hear is that it's the social aspects that makes online learning such a necessary option. In an age where bullying is so pervasive in so many different environments and how it can be really a challenge for kids, as the parent of two teenagers, I know it can be challenging. And just the environments in our schools, the bullying aspect creates, from a social perspective, that need. So at the end of the day, I think that's one of those decisions for that is left up to parents to try to figure out in terms of their own student, their own child, and his or her needs about whether that's the lack of somewhat less socialization, whether that's worth it given the other benefits that might be gained.
Hello, my name is Warren Fishman. Thank you for coming. This has really been a stimulating conversation. You actually kind of raised two questions. One was one of your last comments. But my first question is accountability. I recently had a conversation with somebody whose daughter went through ECOT, and he says she has the equivalent of an 8th grade education because her and her friends, and she graduated from ECOT, but her friends and her easily cheated and waited the deadlines and did whatever they had to do to get through the courses, and so with a 38% graduation rate, meaning that some of those kids cheated to get through. That's kind of horrifying to me, and I guess that brings me to accountability. When you go to a public school or even a private school that follows Ohio standards, you're required to take proficiency tests before you graduate. I don't think that's true with the charter schools. It might be, but why don't we have that? And I think that would be like the number one thing, because, as I said, this conversation I had with the father, his daughter has the equivalent of an 8th grade education. Her school system spent all that money to put her through high school, which she didn't get. Thank you.
You do have to take the state tests when you're in any charter school, and that includes the online schools. But I think one thing we have to keep in mind is, for example, the OGT, which is what the test that we have traditionally taken to prove that you're ready to graduate from high school. Widely recognized, that's an 8th grade test, which is the reason we got rid of it. We now have the new end of course exams. They started last year. They're much more rigorous. We're going to see students get lower scores. The report cards are about to come out. You all are going to see a significant drop in our schools, our performance. Don't panic. It does not mean that the schools suddenly went bad overnight. But what we have done is we've finally said, we're through giving a high school graduation test that's an 8th grade test. We're through giving a 3rd grade reading test where you only have to get 30% of the questions right to be considered proficient. We're done with that. We're raising our standards so that when we tell you that you're at an 8th grade level, you're at an 8th grade level. When we tell you you've graduated from high school, you have the skills to graduate from high school. It's going to take a while for our students and our schools to adjust to these new standards. But rather than get all upset and worry and fret about the scores that are about to come out, just keep in mind, we're trying to elevate the level of education our kids are getting in this state.
I have a quick follow-up to that. If you're going to an e-school and then you take these standardized tests like the AIR test, do you go to a testing facility or do you take it at home?
They do it at a testing facility. Law requires that they be able to do it within 50 miles of their home at a testing center, because these kids are coming from all over the state.
I appreciate the comments on, my name is Jim Cowarden. Appreciate the comments on funding. To answer the auditor's question, does the lack of funding for charter schools adversely affect the education? Absolutely, without question. I question whether it's even a level of 65% of the funding. When you think about having to get a building, you don't control your transportation and many other things. So when charter schools do achieve, they are absolutely climbing the mountain. My question is, how is it fundamentally constitutional to have this system? How is it constitutional to send kids to school in public schools at such a disparity?
Well, we have determined that the constitutionally required level of funding in the state of Ohio is roughly $5,900. And the charter schools all get that $5,900. They don't all get it from the state. This gets very complicated, but this is where the public schools yell foul, is if a public school student in a certain district gets $3,000 from the state, the charter school student gets $3,000 from the state. However, the local school district has to use their money to make up the difference so that every student gets the $5,900. So there is a local component to charter school funding, in spite of the fact that we say all the time that they only get state dollars, they don't get local dollars.
It's a good question. whether there's
Senator,
equal
with all due
protection.
respect.
Right, but as long as they get that $5,900.
Those kids live in a district, and those parents pay taxes in a district. And
That's the counter argument.
And I guess the only thing I would add is every law passed is constitutional until it isn't anymore. So.
Hi, I'm Carol McGuire, and I very much appreciate all three of you being here today. This is certainly one of the most important issues that we have facing us as taxpayers in this state. Some of us would view this as a pretty egregious misuse of tax dollars over a fairly long period of time. And then I read in this morning's dispatch about an official at the Ohio Department of Education who back in 2002 barely looked at an agreement on advice of counsel, signs it, and this is what ECOT is operating under. Now, I recognize all of this may be subject to interpretation, but when you start looking at those kinds of numbers, we could be well north of $1 billion over this past period of time. I've heard very little mention of the Ohio Department of Education and what they may be held to going forward, because quite frankly, I'm not sure that they were given the authority or, quite frankly, competently did what they should be doing as a state agency supervising education. I would appreciate any comments that any one of the three of you or all three would have with regard to what we can look at as far as the Ohio Department of Education in terms of performance going forward.
Well, let me start with that agreement that was mentioned in the court proceedings. I reviewed the agreement, and before I was state auditor, I was prosecuting attorney for Delaware County and was the lawyer for on the civil side for all of the county boards and agencies. I would never have let any of my clients sign that document. It is vague. It has no expiration date, incredibly. It doesn't reference the authority of the agency, as you suggested, to enter into the agreement. There may be an argument that there was applied authority, but it was not something I would have permitted a client to sign. Now, with regards to the ODE, and I've been, let me be charitable, I've been a critic of the agency. I have been very impressed by the initial steps that Paolo DeMaria has taken as superintendent. He comes with an excellent reputation. I've met with him personally, and I find him to be very open, very thoughtful and engaging, and he gets it. He does not come from any individual camp. One of his children actually graduated from a charter school. And so he is I think, a real change agent. Now, whether in the final couple of years of the current administration that ship can be completely righted is a question that we'll all be watching with anxiety. But I am very hopeful that we have the right leader at the right time.
I'm going to be super critical about the way we make education policy in general. I don't think it's strictly the responsibility or the fault of ODE. I don't think it's the fault of the legislature, but they share their blame in the fault. But if you look at how we make education policy in this state, and in most states, I might point out, it is so fractured and so siloed. We have the governor, who certainly has an interest in education, tends to have an education agenda. Then you've got ODE. Then you've got an half elected, half appointed state school board. You've got two different chambers in the legislature, happen right now to be in the same party, but that doesn't mean that we work and play well together in the sandbox either. But when you have a split between the two, it's even worse. Then you've got 615 different districts out there, all with their own elected school boards. And I think I'm leaving out a few people here, but you got thousands of think tanks like Chad, which we couldn't do without. But at the end of the day, policy is not made as thoughtfully, as carefully as it needs to be made. The legislature far too frequently, as does ODE, make policy without really consulting with the people who know best, the principals, the superintendents, and the teachers in the field. And I find that when you do take the time to consult with them, that you end up with a much better procedure or policies. So long term, I'd like to address that issue, and I think until we can figure out a better way to make policy, we're going to make a lot of mistakes.
I'm going to jump in and say we're starting to run out of time, so Chad.
I'll be very short.
And then we have two
I'll
more
quickly
questions.
concur with the auditor that the Department of Education is doing a lot of things right now, so we should also hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're doing the job. The Governor and General Assembly passed a really robust, comprehensive charter school law. Now it's our duty as members of the community to make sure that it's implemented well, because otherwise it's mere words on paper. So Fordham will be publishing a report later this fall looking at House Bill 2 implementation and whether every provision the legislature required, whether there's evidence that is being enforced, put in law, and being acted upon.
See why we can't do without them?
My name is Roger Fox. I work at a dropout recovery school, and struck me that speakers could use a softball question, so I thought I'd try something a little easier for you. And some of you have alluded to this already, but competency-based funding or payment based on students' learning, something that interests us a lot, especially with the student body that we serve. So just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on kind of where that might go in the foreseeable future. Would it be, evenly applied across all schools or just certain schools? We're kind of open to anything that helps our kids get back into the mainstream, and this is an area we think might be very helpful. So thank you.
One of the provisions in House Bill 2 was that we create a study committee to look at dropout recovery schools and specifically look at the question of whether or not we should have some sort of competency or performance-based funding for them. That committee took it a while to get appointed by the various people who had appointing powers, but it finally happened in June, and we had to have a report by August 1st. So our report on August 1st basically said there's a lot more work to be done. We're going to extend it for 6 more months. So we're definitely looking at that. I think it's the way to go, and certainly appreciate any input you want to provide to that committee.
All right, let's fit one more question in here.
Thank you. And I'm Eric Brown. I am not speaking on behalf of the Columbus School Board where I serve, but I am very concerned about the report cards that have been mentioned several times that will be published tomorrow. And you alluded to the fact, Senator Lehner, that people are going to be disappointed. I think that is an understatement. Based on what I'm hearing, the school districts across the state are very concerned about what these will represent. I think that's especially true not in the urban districts as much as it is in the suburbs, where schools have been used to getting A's and B's on those report cards, and I understand that almost nobody will be getting better than a C, if anybody. So it's very troubling. I think that we all know, here at least, that yes, the test has changed 3 times over the last 3 years, that there's nothing that allows us to compare this year's grades with last year's or the year before. But we also know that people will seize on those grades and act on it and talk about it. Can you comment further about that, and what's going to be done by the state or by ODE to correct that problem?
Well, like I said before, the problem is largely created by the fact we have a more rigorous test, we have more rigorous standards, and we have higher cut scores. Those 3 things together are creating this situation. Massachusetts, about 10 years ago, I think it was, decided that they were in the same place. You know, their graduation test was an 8th grade test. And they voluntarily raised all the rigor of their tests and the rigors of their cut scores. And the first 2 or 3 years after that happened, no one looked good. But today, they're not only meeting those standards, they have raised them again. And Massachusetts, unlike the rest of this country, is actually scoring along with the highest performing nations in the world that are all way above where we are. But that's because they raised those standards and they set the bar high, and kids will make a high bar when you set it.
As the parent in a suburban district where these scores will probably not be as great as people would think, I think for the first time they're going to be consistent with some of the other numbers we see in student achievement. 32% of the kids that graduate my district and go to a public college or university need remediation when they get there. You want to talk about a surprise? That's a surprise for families who get report cards with A's and B's. And in terms of our average ACT in the state, if we're looking at how are we preparing people for what's next, it's trickled up, you know, 1/10 of a point here, 1/10 of a point there. And you know what? In the world we live in, with the competition both internationally and with other states, we need to do as well as we can for Ohio students, and that means raising the bar.
All right.
It's a fundamental principle of leadership that people respond to expectations. And if you have mediocre expectations, you get mediocrity. Our kids in Ohio are not stupider than the kids in other countries or the kids in Massachusetts or the kids that are doing well elsewhere. What they need is adults who will set up a system that is going to set high expectations, will provide the resources for them to achieve, and then lead the way. It's time for Ohio to lead the way. I think our kids deserve it. What do you think?
I hope you enjoyed today's forum, and the conversation can continue in the back with coffee and cookies. We encourage you to continue talking with those here on our panel. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio Channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. We'd like you to thank our partner, kidsohio.org, the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, and Hannah News Service, and our speakers, Peggy Lehner, Chad Aldis, Dave Yost, and Andy Chow. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you at CMC another time soon. Thank you.